We begin with the group chat seen around the world after a journalist from The Atlantic was mistakenly added to a text chain with high-level Trump officials as they discussed sensitive military operations earlier this month. During a Senate intel hearing today, CIA Director John Ratcliffe and National Intelligence Director Tulsi Gabbard, both of whom were on the text chain, claimed nothing classified was shared and repeatedly dodged as Democrats grilled them.
Were you using your private phone or a public phone for the Signal discussions?
I won't speak to this because it's under review.
Everybody in America,
so clearly,
there's nothing to
Senator,
see here is what your testimony is.
No, you were not TG on this group chat.
I'm not going to get into the specifics.
So you refuse to acknowledge whether you were on this group chat?
Senator, I'm not going to get into the specifics.
Why are you?
This was a huge mistake, correct?
No.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth also deflecting while addressing the scandal late yesterday, smearing the journalist involved. And tonight, CBS reporting that Trump special envoy Steve Witkoff was participating in the group chat while he was in Moscow. Gabbard admitting in her testimony today that she too was outside the United States. Democrats didn't hold back in their condemnation.
Sloppy, careless, incompetent behavior.
There ought to be resignation, starting with the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of Defense.
American lives could have been lost.
This disrespect for our intelligence agencies and the personnel who work for them is entirely unacceptable. It's an embarrassment.
What a colossal screw-up.
Donald Trump initially claimed he was completely unaware of the security breach, but today he told NBC News that he would stand by NSA advisor Mike Waltz, who added the journalist to the group chat, saying he had, quote, learned a lesson. Republicans looking to dodge accountability despite spending the last decade blasting high-profile Democrats like Hillary Clinton for security lapses. It includes one of the officials at the center of this scandal, Fox News host turned defense secretary Pete Hegseth.
If there was anyone other than Hillary Clinton, they would be in jail right now. If you are using unclassified means, there is the potential for and likelihood that foreign governments are targeting those accounts. People we rely on to do dangerous and difficult thing for us rely on one thing from us, that we will not reveal their identity and not be reckless with what the dangerous things they're doing for us.
Any security professional, military, government, or otherwise, would be fired on the spot for this type of conduct and criminally prosecuted for being so reckless with this kind of information.
Irony thy name is the Trump administration. It's worth noting that Republicans never had credible evidence that Clinton's email server was ever hacked by a foreign adversary or a journalist. Joining me now to discuss this, Sabrina Singh, former Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary, and Mark Leibovich, staff writer for The Atlantic, whose editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg, was a journalist involved in this explosive group chat. There's so many things here that are offensive and annoying and foolish. But Sabrina, I'm going to start with just the basics, just from a professional standpoint, right? How likely is it that nobody in this group realized that this was dangerous? That's the thing that sort of confuses me. I could understand if perhaps some of these people who are relatively new to government, like Pete Hegseth, were like, yeah, we can do this on the Signal chat, we can do it on group chat. Why was no one else in this situation aware enough to say, hey, guys, maybe this isn't such a good idea?
Well, even Pete Hegseth, I mean, you look at the comments that he made previously when he was a Fox News host. I mean, he knows, I mean, he served in the military. He knows how dangerous it is to move classified information to an unclassified text app. And so this is something that all professionals, even when you get into government, you are given a tutorial on how to handle classified information. Moving it to a classified system, an unclassified system, I mean, that is breaking the law. And I think what's really important here is that these are not just any DOD state employees. This is the entire national security apparatus on a signal thread talking about an ongoing operation while we have fighter pilots in the air. I mean, if an adversary had intercepted these text threads, they could have been killed. And that is incredibly dangerous.
And I want to add to it, it was an ongoing, like they weren't discussing the Christmas party, right? This was an ongoing operation, so people were in immediate sort of danger. That's part of what gets me. But I got to follow up with this. And then the messaging afterwards, this sort of notion of first saying, well, we didn't know, and then we kind of didn't know, and then really it's somebody else's fault. What would a responsible administration do? What is, as someone who was a press secretary, what should be happening right now?
Well, what should be happening and what would happen in any normal sense of order would be that these officials would probably be placed on leave, and there would be an immediate investigation. Or if not leave, there would be an investigation by the inspector generals of each agency and by Congress. I mean, that is the right thing to do. If this was any other, say, a DOD employee, they would be immediately placed on leave and investigated, and that is the right process. And so they should be held to the same accountability. I mean, you heard the clips right before. I think you know very well all the turmoil that we dealt with on her emails and the server. That same accountability applies to these individuals.
That would be the reasonable thing to do. Right. So Mark, I've thought of, I've done sort of multiple scenarios of this in my head. And one thing that occurred to me, and as a journalist with The Atlantic, this is what my thought was. There are people who have debated whether or not, Mr. Goldberg should have gotten on or off, or had he stayed in the chat. Some people say, hey, Bob Woodward would have stayed for years, right? We all have choices. My thought is, was there a danger to him if he had stayed on? Because given how vindictive and vicious this administrative might have been, they may have held him accountable or tried to jail or punish him for a mistake they made. Is that something that was a real concern?
I'm sure it was. I mean, I can't speak to, what Jeff was worried about or what the lawyer said and so forth. But no, I mean, we and Jeff specifically has, pretty robust history of sort of going at it with the Trump administration. Right. And he certainly has singled out our magazine and Jeff in the past. Look, I think Jeff did the entirely right thing. And I'm not just saying that because I work there or because he's my boss, but full disclosure, he is. But, he stayed on. He actually got off. He informed them he was on the chat. That was a response. He didn't have to do that. He did. I mean, I'm sure it's possible the administration could cook up some reason to go after him in some probably frivolous way. But I also think they probably don't want to draw any additional attention to this. And they also know that Jeff probably has a lot more receipts that he did not use and could, I guess, in the right circumstance. Again, I'm not privy to these discussions, but I do think that, look, I mean, there are so many levels of misconduct here, recklessness certainly. I guess the innocent response is they were just so overwhelmed with what they were dealing with, and obviously the seriousness of the material that they weren't running checks in their own mind about whose initials are this, who is JG, what is this, and not really thinking it through. Again, you can see that happening, but at the same time, look, I mean, it's a entertaining in some ways kind of train wreck situation to follow. On the other hand, it's extremely serious, and I don't think we should lose sight of that.
It's incredibly serious, and I have reported a lot, and I've talked a lot on this show and other programs about the danger to journalists under this administration. And in a circumstance like this, where you're getting access to this information, and obviously, look, Jeff was super responsible. Like he says, I'm not going to put anybody's name out there. But there was a key moment where they were discussing on this group chat people who are undercover. Right? Individuals who were in the field, whose lives could be endangered at this particular point. What is the journalistic ethics under those circumstances? Obviously, you're not supposed to say anything, but would you not have an obligation to expose every single person in that potential chat because they're endangering national security?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously, if you are on that chat, you don't want to expose anyone who's in harm's way, certainly out in the field or any kind of operative anywhere. I mean, obviously, that's something you talk about with your higher ups, but since Jeff is the higher up, I would imagine he would never do that anyway. Look, I mean, I do think when you're in a position like this and you're in a high level and you've been cleared supposedly, extensively, you should know better, right? And you should never be putting yourself in a position where, you're on a thread that is not secure, and certainly that a journalist has been invited onto, and not expect to be exposed in some way. And again, I mean, you're just doing your job, and someone decided to let a journalist on. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't sympathize with that, but I also think that this is probably something that they obviously would love to have back.
I want to play some sound really quick for you, Sabrina. This is Senator Ossoff and Ratcliffe going back and forth at the hearing. Get your thoughts on the other side.
a national political reporter
You can characterize it how you want.
was made privy
The White
to
House has
sensitive
made
information
clear
about
that there
imminent
was an
military
inadvertent
operations against a
mistake,
foreign terrorist
an inadvertent
organization.
mistake of adding a reporter.
And that wasn't a huge
to a
mistake?
seal.
That wasn't a huge mistake?
Well, I think they characterize
This is
it
an
as a
embarrassment.
mistake.
There's been no apology. There has been no recognition of the gravity of this error. And by the way, we will get the full transcript of this chain, and your testimony will be measured carefully against its content.
Sabrina, that comment really struck me. It's like, so you can lie to me right now, but we're going to get the receipts and we're going to expose you. What are, again, the potential consequences? What can the Senate really do? I mean, they can condemn people, but these are sort of presidential appointments. What can they potentially do as a consequence if it's discovered that many of these people testifying are lying or obfuscating?
Well, I think the problem here is also that, Democrats don't have the levers of control. So I think Democrats and Republicans who have sounded the alarm before on things like emails and other leaks should come together. This should actually be a bipartisan issue and say, look, what happened here was wrong. How do we fix this going forward? And how do we make sure this never happens again? I think also the bigger issue here is this is probably not the first time that they have set up these, Signal chats. And my question would be, Signal was not an app that is on many government phones. So I'd be curious to know if these were personal devices also being used, because you have to imagine the entire national security apparatus. Our adversaries are trying actively to intercept messages like this. This is exactly how they want to know how the United States fights, how the United States operates, and conducts their military operations. If anyone had intercepted these messages, I mean, absolutely, they put our U.S. military men and women, our men and women in uniform, at risk. Right. And that is a huge problem. And so that absolutely needs to be investigated. Now, again, Democrats don't control the House or the Senate, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep the attention going and keep this drumbeat up.
Today, yet more examples that the Social Security Administration is in turmoil because of the cuts that Elon Musk and Doge are making. The Washington Post reports the Social Security Administration website crashed 4 times in 10 days this month, blocking millions of retirees and disabled Americans from logging into their online accounts because the servers were overloaded. That comes as 2 sources tell Axios the administration is rushing to cut phone services at the White House's request. Which brings us to Frank Bisignano, facing questions from lawmakers today in his bid to become Social Security's permanent administrator. It's had 4 administrators in the past 5 months to serve 73 million retired workers. But his approach appears to contradict what's been happening.
When you have a system that is not working now, do you think it's a great idea to lay off half of the employees?
I don't know do I think it's a great idea to lay off half of the employees when a system doesn't work? I think the answer is probably no.
Have you been consulted by the acting commissioner about Doge's work at the Social Security Administration?
I have not had a conversation about anything with this Social Security commissioner who's acting right now.
Joining us now, NBC's Julie Sirkin, reporting from Capitol Hill. Mark McKinnon is former advisor to George W. Bush and John McCain and creator of The Circus. So, Julie, what did we learn about the future of Social Security from today's confirmation hearing?
Well, Chris, Frank Bisignano, who is the CEO of Pfizer, of a financial technology company that he actually brought into good financial standing. They more than doubled their stock prices during his time as the leader of that company. So you could see what kind of approach he's taken to things. That does concern some Democrats, though, who spent the majority of their questions asking and prodding him specifically on whether he would curtail Elon Musk and Doge's efforts, especially when it comes to accessing Americans' personally identifiable information. He was asked about this point blank. Take a listen to this exchange, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
Will you lock Doge out of Social Security databases?
I'm going to do whatever is required to protect the information that is private information. So I don't know what lock Doge out means.
Are you willing to commit right now that you will put enough people back to work so they can do the job of delivering the benefits that Americans earned? Yes or no?
I will commit to have the right staffing to get the job done.
To get the job done, meaning delivering the benefits people are entitled to?
Yes.
Now, Bisignano vowed that there will be no impact to seniors, millions of whom are relying and receive these benefits. He did, of course, say that he will be looking to streamline and modernize the agency. That agency will be insolvent in the matter of this decade, Chris, if Congress or the government doesn't do something to save it. However, it's extremely unpopular. It's known as the third rail of politics for a reason to touch this agency. Bisignano saying he could even use AI to root out what he called waste, fraud, and abuse. That is, of course, a similar line that we've been hearing from Elon Musk's own efforts over at Doge. So Bisignano there testifying before the committee that oversees the Social Security Administration. Chris?
Julie Sirkin, thank you for that. So, Mark, you heard the reporting, the turmoil, website crashing, phone service in danger. But today, the man who wants to lead the program made it clear that he believes customer services are critical. Take a listen.
I think we have to meet beneficiaries where they want to be, and I think that includes field offices, it includes the phone, it includes technology on the phone, and then it includes a live agent if they want to talk to somebody.
Do those priorities clash with what we're actually seeing?
Yeah, and I can testify personally. First of all, I'll say I've been electrocuted by the third rail when I worked for George W. Bush, and he tried to talk about privatizing some aspects of Social Security.
That
and
wasn't pretty, Mark. That was not pretty.
It was not pretty at all. We got crushed for it. So I've been shocked by the notion that this discussion about tampering with Social Security. And just again, I can personally testify. I'm 70 years old this year. So I've been dealing with this, and because listen, I'm better online than most people my age, but I'm still somewhat of a Luddite. So when I got frustrated trying to do this all online, I went down to the Social Security office, and first of all, there was a line around the block, and by the time I finally got to see somebody, they said, "Oh, we can't talk to you. You have to make an appointment," and they said you have to do that by phone. So now, if they don't have phones, how is somebody supposed to do this? Because it doesn't work when you go to the office. If you can't do it online, your only option is the phone, and now they take away that option. It's insane.
Yeah, I had a situation where I said, I have power of attorney. I can provide you the power of attorney. And they said, we don't accept power of attorney as proof. So NBC News reports that Trump allies are pressing the White House to dial back Elon Musk's media interviews over criticisms like these of Social Security. Take a listen.
Most of the federal spending is entitlements. So that's like the big one to eliminate.
Social Security is the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time.
Is the Republican concern over those remarks an acknowledgement that Social Security is the third rail of politics, or are they so afraid of Elon Musk that the fact that from all reporting across the country, people are lining up where they do show up to yell at them, and where they don't show up, they're calling their offices? What's more important?
Well, Elon Musk said the quiet part out loud about entitlements, and he's right about that. But he knows, he knows more about people on Mars than he does about seniors in America, because this is their lifeline. And I suspect this is where he's really going to get the leash pulled in, because President Trump has been pretty consistent about this over the years, talking about not touching Social Security. And I can tell you, as an ad maker, that line about Social Security being a Ponzi scheme, you're going to see that in Democratic ads everywhere in the midterms.
Yeah, Mark, a Republican lawmaker, in fact, told NBC News, the more of these Musk interviews, the more discussion we'll have. I think the entire 2026 campaign will be a referendum on Musk. Is that kind of saying the quiet part out loud that every Republican is facing next year?
Well, it does. And the one other thing I'd add is that he is right about the entitlements being where the money is. But, for example, in our defense spending, we spend 9 times as much on defense as China. 3 times as much, and 9 times as much as Russia or any other country. So if you want to make some cuts, Elon, go to the Defense Department and talk to Pete Hegseth.
Mark McKinnon, it'll be interesting to do a survey. Would you rather get your Social Security cut or defense spending cut? I'm willing, I'm not a bettor, but I'm willing to place a bet on how that would turn out. Always good to see you, Mark. Thank you. Don't look a day over 45.
Thinking to myself, honestly, I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm glad that Mike Waltz didn't invite a Houthi into the group, or a Russian spy, or an adversary of the United States. But put that aside. I'm reading this and I'm wondering, not only why am I reading this, but why would the Secretary of the Treasury need to know the precise attack sequence of this upcoming operation?
Atlantic editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg exposing some of the glaring national security concerns around National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who was the official who started that Signal group chat and invited Goldberg to it. Calls have been growing for accountability since that bombshell report yesterday, starting with the resignations of officials involved.
Both the mishandling of classified information and the deliberate destruction of federal records are potential crimes that ought to be investigated immediately. And I want to make clear that I'm of the view that there ought to be resignations, starting with the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of Defense.
Joining us now, former United States Ambassador to the United Nations and former National Security Advisor to President Obama, Ambassador Susan Rice. Ambassador Rice, putting your National Security Advisor hat back on, your reaction to this report?
It's stunning. It's likely the biggest national security debacle that any professional can remember. Let me explain a bit why this is so crazy. First of all, National Security Advisors convene what is called the National Security Principles Committee. This is the cabinet-level group that makes the most important decisions and recommendations to the president on national security. It's all those people that are on that chat: the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, the CIA Director, and others. By the way, it's bizarre to me that it appears the acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs was not on that Signal chat. But in any case, the norm is that you call a meeting of the national security principles, typically in person, in the White House Situation Room, which is a very secure facility in the basement of the White House. You can't bring your phones in. You can't bring your Apple Watches in, because all of those are devices that can be used by our adversaries to listen to what's going on. And then you spend hours, literally hours, interrogating the entire concept. Is this the right time? Is this the right plan? What are the regional security ramifications? What are the diplomatic ramifications? How do we ensure that we have prepared the allies? How do we communicate this to the public? This kind of planning for a military operation should be done very carefully and very deliberately, not on a Signal chat, not with emojis, and not without very careful deliberation. For the Trump people to be saying this chat shows how seriously they take the decision-making process makes me laugh out loud. I would share, as all my previous predecessors would have, very thoughtful, detailed, deliberate meetings in the White House Situation Room, probably multiple meetings. We would never get on a Signal chat, which is inherently insecure. They did this in all likelihood on their personal phones. They were discussing what is inherently a classified topic, which is whether and when the United States might launch military action against an adversary. There's no spinning that that's not a classified conversation. The very fact of the National Security Cabinet considering and recommending to the president a military attack is by definition classified, because you do not want your adversaries to know that information in advance so that they can prepare, evade, or attack American personnel in the process. So this is an extraordinary breach, even leaving aside the mind-boggling fact that they let a reporter into the conversation. They had an inherently sensitive, classified discussion about the most sensitive kind of information, war planning, on a non-governmental, non-secure, non-classified application. I can't get my head around it, Alicia, honestly.
With one participant participating, we now know from Moscow. Should Mike Waltz have submitted a resignation letter today?
Well, let me say this. First of all, this absolutely needs to be thoroughly investigated. I can't imagine in any prior administration that a national security advisor, Secretary of Defense, and very importantly, the Director of National Intelligence and the CIA Director all know what is classified. Their job is to protect classified, that they all willingly participated without even batting an eye in a classified conversation on a non-secure, non-government application. I mean, frankly, nobody would survive that in any previous administration. Now, obviously, these people have utter disregard for norms and frankly, our national security, or they wouldn't have conducted such a sensitive conversation in this way. And obviously, since nobody balked at the notion that they would have this conversation on the Signal app, it suggests very much that they do this all the time, that this is their normal modus operandi. And now we learned today that Tulsi Gabbard was overseas. We learned Witkoff was in Russia. That's like just hand it to the Russians on a silver platter. You're sitting in a Moscow hotel room. Give me a break. And Alicia, people need to understand, we have ways of doing this. Every member of the President's National Security Cabinet, every national security advisor, when they travel, they have a team of communicators that go with them that set up secure communications by phone, by video, to enable people, if they're not present in Washington and in the White House, to communicate. Every single one of them has in their home what is called a secure compartmented information facility, a SCIF. It's like a room or a closet that has been specially tailored to ensure that you can have sensitive classified conversations in there and the equipment to do it. This is pure laziness, malpractice, recklessness, and probably also a desire to hide from the Presidential Records Act the legal responsibility to keep written communications that happen and between government officials and particularly national security officials for the public record. So there are many, many ways that it was so crazy.
There's something you said that I want to make sure we go back to. I think the word you used was bizarre to describe what seemed like the acting chair of the Joint Chiefs not being on that thread. Why might they leave the acting chair of the Joint Chiefs out of a discussion like this?
Well, let me say, I mean, I'm inferring that from the list of people that Jeff Goldberg reported were in the conversation. There were two people at least were missing that would normally be in that conversation: the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, in this case the acting chairman, and the Central Command commander, the CENTCOM commander, whose area of operations this took place in. Normally, they would be involved and be providing their military advice and judgment. But if the chairman of the Joint Chiefs participated in a Signal chat about a military operation, I would be blown away. They know better. Why they were excluded is remarkable to me. They are the ones with the technical knowledge and expertise as to how this is going to be executed. So that is troubling to me in the extreme and raises a question of how are these people making national security decisions? Who's giving advice to the president? The chairman's role is to be the advisor to the president on military affairs. Like, what is going on?
The leader of the opposition party in the UK tweeted this today. J.D. Vance and his mates clearly aren't fit to run a group chat, let alone the world's strongest military force. It has to make our security services nervous about the intelligence we're sharing with them. I have to imagine that is a version of a conversation that all of our allies are having in the wake of this absolute fiasco.
Absolutely, no doubt. They're all gobsmacked and freaked out that the information that we regularly share amongst allies is so compromised potentially by this kind of reckless management of the national security decision-making process. But I think the European allies are also very likely concerned about what J.D. Vance revealed about his perspective on this. He was very clear in the chat saying, you know, that he was concerned that we were not screwing our European allies by leaving them hanging because they, like us, depend on the free flow of traffic through the Red Sea and these waterways. For J.D. Vance to rather screw our European allies than support a military operation against an Iranian-backed terrorist organization that has attacked American personnel and its ships is mind-blowing. Why would that not be the priority? But instead, he was more concerned about, well, we'd be helping our European allies by doing this, and therefore that's not what we want to do. There's so many aspects of this which are really quite mind-boggling.
As we wait for that, we're joined by NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, NBC's chief Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence Frank Figliuzzi, and former CIA Director John Brennan. Guys, we're going to be tap dancing here as we poke in and out of this hearing we're watching on Capitol Hill. But Garrett, before it kicks off, you just spoke to President Trump by phone about this. What did he tell you, and does he have confidence still in key members of his administration?
He does, Allie. We had a brief phone conversation in which the president defended Michael Waltz, the national security advisor who created this group chat. He told me Waltz is a good man who he thinks has learned a lesson here in all of this. He described this entire episode as a glitch, essentially saying that it's the one thing from these past 2 months that his critics can cling to attack the administration. And that he argued that because these attacks in Yemen were ultimately so successful, the fact that Goldberg, whom he described as a sleazeball, was a part of these chats is essentially immaterial. He praised Pete Hegseth for his forceful response, denying any war plans were discussed, despite that sort of running into the problems with just basic credibility, given what we know from Goldberg's accounting of this group chat, and overall seemed to be trying to dismiss and move on from this incident as we enter day 2 and what amounts to wall-to-wall coverage of it here in Washington.
Well, and Garrett, as we wait to see that Senate hearing room that you and I both know so well, key administration officials set to testify before senators in just a few minutes. We'll go there as soon as it kicks off. But in the meantime, as we continue parsing through what Jeffrey Goldberg got a front row seat to, the VP in that chat floated disagreement with the plan to bomb the Houthis. And then the deputy chief of staff, Stephen Miller, allegedly comes in and says, nope, this is what we're doing. Per the president, he was clear. I thought it really gave some insight into how the administration talks through decisions, makes decisions, but also the way that they're thinking about foreign policy and Europe, and then, of course, where the true power epicenters are. Garrett, what else did you see in that based on what you know about this White House and what we're learning about how they work?
Yeah, Allie, I agree. I think that was one of the most interesting parts of this reporting. The vice president didn't just disagree with the plan here. He suggested that the plan was because the president was ill-informed or not perhaps realizing the impact of a decision that he was making. Notable, of course, because of how closely Vance has allied himself with the president in public, these disagreements that, we presume often happen between presidents and vice presidents come out into public in this way, and the fact that it was, of all people, Stephen Miller to apparently shut down that conversation and those disagreements. It's clear that Stephen Miller, who has been a close Trump aide going back to 2015 now, is ascendant in this White House and speaks for the president across a variety of topics, including, it turns out, foreign policy.
Garrett Haake, as always, thank you. And as we look at the screen, Ryan Nobles, you see the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Tom Cotton, seated next to, of course, the ranking member of that committee, Mark Warner, longtime member of the Intel Committee. And so as we watch them caffeinate, Cotton seemingly with his coffee and Warner seemingly with something else caffeinated, they're ready to kick off, but what are you looking for in this hearing against the backdrop of some Republicans still downplaying this Signal group chat? And what about the rare few who aren't?
Well, we know for sure, Allie, that this is forcing Democrats to take a hard pivot into what they thought the focus of this hearing was going to be. And I think you're going to see Democrat after Democrat not just let this go, want specific answers about why this happened, and then from a wider scale, how often chats like Signal are used to conduct government business along a wide range of issues across the administration. But then to your point about how the Republicans respond to this, we had a tepid response from Republicans yesterday, many acknowledging that this probably wasn't the best case scenario. This is not necessarily the type of forum that this type of delicate information should be shared. And it will be interesting to see if any of these Republicans use this opportunity to ask more probing questions about how pervasive the use of Signal is across the administration within these intelligence communities and within these intelligence apparatus. If we find that they don't touch on this at all, that could be a clear indication of just how much oversight congressional Republicans will actually have into this issue and whether or not they're just going to hope it goes away. Democrats aren't going to let that happen. They're going to try and bring it up as often as possible possible. But, Ali, as we know, Republicans run the show right now on Capitol Hill. And for the most part, they've been submissive to the Trump administration and not providing any sort of pushback or oversight. This could give us a glimpse about a real issue with tangible problems connected to it and whether or not Republicans assert themselves as a co-equal branch of government to make sure that this practice is reined in to prevent something like this from happening again, Ali.
Yeah, that is exactly right, Ryan. And we've seen some senators, including Mike Rounds, saying, yeah, this might come up during the hearings. Senator Cotton, again, the chair of the Intel Committee now, has gavelled in. He's giving his opening remarks. This is someone who is clear-eyed about the national security threats that the United States faces. And so we will be listening as we continue talking about if Senator Cotton brings up the Signal chat and the national security implications to it. But Director Brennan, President Trump told Garrett that this wasn't, in his words, a serious glitch. Do you agree? And if one of your deputies at the CIA had been responsible for an Intel blunder like this, would they be pretty immediately out of a job?
Well, it was a very serious, deliberate, and intentional violation of the rules that govern the handling of classified information. It was quite noticeable that there was a number of cabinet officials who were included on this chat, and the inclusion of war plans that were underway in terms of hitting the Houthis clearly was very, not just inappropriate, but also, again, a violation of the rules. And so anybody who in the intelligence community or Defense Department who had done this, I mean, there would have been immediate action taken, suspension of security clearances, as well as possible termination, again, because of the deliberate nature of this. And also it raises the question, why did none of these individuals on this chat raise concerns about this being the forum for this type of discussion? Signal, yes, it's an encrypted chat, but it's not approved for any type of classified information. It's being used on personal cell phones, and these are phones that are kept on one's person or in one's house, and so somebody could access that does not have the authorization for it. But as Ryan mentioned, it does raise the question about how many other chats are taking place on this and other types of platforms that are inappropriate for the discussion about national security matters. So, again, if the Trump administration believes that this is not serious, they could put out the entire transcript, because also I think there are people who are claiming in the White House that this was not classified. But thank goodness Jeffrey Goldberg, I think, recognized that some of the information may have been involving sensitive intelligence matters, and he decided not to put out some of these details. So I think there's still a lot to the story that we are yet to learn.
I think that's exactly right, especially if you listen to the way that Jeffrey Goldberg was talking on Morning Joe this morning about the ways that he decided what was okay to report here, the details that he held back because of national security concerns. Frank, Director Brennan tees us up nicely, though, because even if you take away the accidental inclusion of a journalist in that chat, should those officials even be having that conversation on Signal at all?
Yeah, let's be absolutely clear to our viewers here. This is totally unauthorized, unacceptable use of a commercial encrypted app for highly classified discussions. It's not how this is supposed to happen. And why? Because we know our adversaries every day try to crack codes, not only government encrypted codes, but certainly commercially available codes. You've got to assume that these individuals' specific phones are being targeted strongly every day. As I was assistant director for overseeing all counterintelligence at FBI, here's how this would work in the Hoover building, FBI headquarters. I'd become aware of this kind of leak. I led all leak investigations in the FBI. I would walk up to the 7th floor, the senior executive floor of the FBI, and I would tell the deputy director or director, we need to open a leak investigation. We need to coordinate this throughout the intel community because of the level of these officials. But we would eventually open some kind of inquiry to figure out what happened and then assess damage to what happened. Do I have confidence that that's what's happening on the 7th floor of the FBI right now, that they're considering opening an investigation, which would likely be a violation of 18 U.S.C. 793 subsection F, an inadvertent unauthorized disclosure? No, I do not have confidence that that discussion is taking place or that a case will be opened.
Well, that is certainly one of the questions that we could hear from Democratic senators, because the FBI director, Kash Patel, is among those officials sitting before them right now. And just to remind people of who we're going to hear from, it's not just Patel. It's also the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, as well as the head of the CIA, John Ratcliffe. They were already booked to be in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. But of course, now we see them here under completely new circumstances. But Director Brennan, U.S. allies were already skittish about intelligence sharing because of the Trump administration's pivot towards Russia, as well as because of some of the key personnel who are in the very seats before the Senate right now. Does this just create new doubts about existing ones about sharing sensitive information? And could this jeopardize further those partnerships?
I think it reinforces the perception that the Trump administration is not serious about protecting classified information and intelligence. And a lot of the intelligence that the U.S. intelligence community has comes from our allies and partners overseas. And so if I were the head of a foreign intelligence service, one of our allies, I would have to think twice and three times about what it is that I want to share with the Americans because of this type of reckless and careless behavior in terms of how they handle information. We have seen what Donald Trump did with information down at Mar-a-Lago, but now this is a continuation of it. And the fact that you have individuals like a Pete Hegseth, who has no real experience at the executive level, and clearly by the inclusion of this information in the Signal chat, demonstrates that he doesn't have, I think, the acumen as well as the necessary experience to be a Secretary of Defense, putting this information at great risk. So again, I think people around the globe, and not just our allies and partners, but our adversaries, as was pointed out, they are the ones who are actively targeting the individuals in this administration, targeting their communication systems, targeting the personnel that support them, and other things.